Perfect. Thank you. All right, everybody, welcome and thank you so much for joining us for this final session outside of our keynote for the CALM Conference of 2024. So excited to welcome Abigail L. Phillips and Dustin Fife. They will be presenting on human-centered approaches to supervisors and managers supporting accommodations in libraries. Such an important and challenging aspect of managers' work, and so I'm really looking forward to what you have to share. Before we get started, just a couple of our logistics. This session is being recorded and captions are available during this session. You can just click on the Live CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And thanks so much to Danielle for providing this. Please use the Q&A feature also at the bottom of your Zoom window for asking any questions for the presenters, which I'll be moderating at the end of the session. And then use the chat for general comments, technical issues. Joanna is going to be our technical coordinator, so she'll be monitoring the chat, providing some different resources, as well as links, including for collaborative resource sharing. So if you have any related readings or podcast resources that you think would be really valuable for this, please do share and that will get added in. And finally, we also have our code of conduct, which hopefully we won't have to use, but it is our guide for maintaining excellence in our community for both our presenters and attendees. And if you have any concerns or need to connect with someone, you can look for the CALM COC ahead of our code of conduct on call folks. So that's Chris today. So if you have any questions or want to reach out to someone, please don't hesitate. All right, I think we're ready to get started. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Abigail and Dustin.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all the work that everyone in the background is doing to keep CALM going. And we're excited to be here with you all today. Let's go ahead and just jump in and start by introducing ourselves. And Abby, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name is Abigail Phillips. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Information Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I'm a former public librarian, but now been in academia for 12 years and going up for tenure this fall. So I'm telling anyone that so they will feel pity for me and give me treats. So, and also my thing is Dustin likes what he's talked about, or he's going to talk about his thing. I'm not a beach fan, but I will look at all your cat pics and enjoy them. I won't pretend to enjoy them. Okay. That's me.
All right. Oh, jump too fast. My name is Dustin Fife. I'm the college librarian at Colorado College in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And that was a lot of C's. I've been in libraries for 16 years. I've actually probably been in libraries most of my life, but I've been working in libraries for 16 years. 6 as a public library director, 8 as an academic library director or college librarian. And I do like long walks on the beach, but cold beaches, not hot beaches. All right. To just show you what we're doing today, we're gonna go through the project that we've done, the source of our information with you all, and then some of the themes that are coming out of this. If you don't know, we are going to be talking about our original research today and some of the things we've learned from that research thus far for the first part of the project we've done and where we plan to go with it. But here's our presentation roadmap. And let's go ahead and tell you a bit about our research project. First and foremost, it was a qualitative interview project, a phenomenology to be more exact, and it was long form in the sense that we didn't have short surveys or short answer questions for the most part. It was really open-ended from beginning to end, and really was focused on, once again, being a phenomenology, which meant the people being interviewed were and are what is important about it, not us, not even which library they work in or what part of the world they live in, but what their experience was. We worked with 12 people from across the United States, They all worked in publicly funded academic libraries. They all volunteered or are self-selected participants. And we've used emergent coding in the sense that we had research questions. We did not and are not testing a hypothesis. Our kind of value at the bottom of this is that when in doubt, their experiences and voices are what matter here. The experiences and the voices of the interviewees. Finally, we are talking today about managers and supervisors, and that specific part of it. There's much more to the interviews than just that. So while we're going to concentrate on a few themes today, this isn't the end of this research. We're in the writing process. We are also looking at other similar research projects as well. So, but for this particular presentation today, we are pretty hyper focused on just a few parts of the interviews and not being expansive. Anything I missed, Abby?
I think you covered it all. Excellent.
Great. All right, our research questions. You want to do those, Abby?
Sure. Our first research question is, what experiences have librarians and library workers encountered seeking accommodations in their workplaces? I don't know, we didn't mention that this is all since COVID. Our participants sought accommodations since COVID has occurred. So just kind of giving you a little context, give a little more context. And our second research question, what can library administrators do to improve the accommodation request experiences of librarians and library workers?
Great. Here's a snippet of some of our interview questions. These are the actual questions we asked, things like, who was not helpful on campus in your experience? Who was helpful on campus in your experience? How did your supervisor help or hinder you in your accommodation seeking process? What was your general experience when seeking an accommodation? So these aren't all of our questions. I think if I remember correctly, there was about 15 of them in general. Some of them were shorter and some of them were like, hey, go for it. Tell us your whole experience, whatever you want to share with us, go get it in there. Abby, anything else you want to share here?
I believe I don't think this needs to be added, but I'm an accessibility nerd. So I believe we shared these interview questions like a week or two beforehand with the participants, because that's needed for some people like me.
Yeah, and that's part of our process too that we can talk about when you are interested in the research details. One of the things I like that we did was we provided questions in advance because once again, our value was we were interested in their experiences. So we aren't trying to catch people off guard or do anything like that. Also, we allowed people to add to their transcript of the interview afterwards, because I'll keep saying it, like we weren't looking for any sort of pool that had to be built in a particular way. We just wanted people to feel comfortable in sharing their experiences, and so we gave them multiple opportunities to add information, which I found to be a very good practice for a phenomenological study. All right. The stories we heard were incredibly personal. I just need to say here that the longer I've thought about the interviews that we did, I am incredibly grateful to the people we worked with for their openness, for their willingness to share, to speak with us, because they really let us into their lives and to what they experienced. And the information we have would be nothing without their openness, their vulnerability, and their willingness to be with us. The folks were incredibly detailed. They were relational in the sense that they remember who did what, when, and where, but they weren't weren't bitter in their recollections. They were precise and they were direct, and it was incredible to hear that and to work with those people. For today, one of the things we want to really emphasize with you all from the stories we heard is that managers and supervisors played an instrumental role in the experiences of our interviewees, but we're not going to bury the lead. We're going to say right now, those experiences were primarily negative experiences, even when it's successful, and they were a lot of work. All right. So let's start talking about some of the themes. We'll go back and forth on these. I want to emphasize again, we are not emphasizing all of the themes today, just the ones that we feel are most particularly relevant to this topic at this conference, with talking about leadership management and human-centered approaches. So first and foremost, the coding I wrote the most throughout all of these interviews was process burden. And Abby and I will both talk about what that means to us, but these are some of those ideas. It took a huge amount of labor. If you want to talk about being human-centered, there was not a single person that we talked with that didn't make it very clear that seeking an accommodation was a process burden. It took a huge amount of time, labor, mental, emotional effort over and over again. It took a lot of time in the moment, like week by week, but it also took a long period of time. There was a huge amount of labor that went into this through paperwork, through appointments with HR, appointments with their supervisors, appointments with their colleagues, but doctor's appointments that they had to pay fees for, doctor's appointments that they had to have redone because the paperwork wasn't perfectly done. The process was repeatedly described as dehumanizing. This process burden over and over and over again was described as dehumanizing. And in those words and not in those words, but I kept coming back to the code of process burden. Trying to get a reasonable accommodation creates a huge amount of process burden for the individual. Abby, anything you'd like to add?
Nuts, it went right from my mind. Okay. I think when I'm reflecting about it right now, process burden, this to me, with dealing with going through the mental health, like seeking out psychiatrists and therapists, it's not unlike that. These people are dealing with, or our participants are dealing with life-threatening illnesses or mental health issues, and they're dealing with all that while having to deal with paperwork and more appointments and describing their disability in excruciating detail. I don't think they were using the word excruciating, but in detail.
Yeah, we thought about that a lot. Lisa Martin just threw up in the chat the phrase that the accommodations process is adversarial. Now, I think that's perfect. It's you know, we want our justice system to be adversarial, but the accommodation seeking process shouldn't be, and it is. And like we really saw that through this concept of a process burden. Like it is a burden that is placed primarily on the individual who needs it. And as Abby was just pointing out, for some of our folks, the process happened when they were probably least capable, not least capable, but least in a position to handle the labor that it took. So it was a huge additional burden on top of being a process burden. So antagonistic, KT Vaughn just threw that same phrase, that phrase into the chat as well. Adversarial, antagonistic. They are very great for this. All right. Next big theme that we want to pull out.
The collegial dynamics of seeking accommodations. So interactions with colleagues. So when we were doing coding and just digging into the interviews and listening to the interviews, we saw a theme that colleagues, for some people, it was largely a peripheral role, but these were still very impactful. Some were had more very supportive and very engaged colleagues, but others had some that were less than ideal, passive aggressive, critical, or just no relationship at all. I thought it was interesting that a few of the participants felt the need to explain their disability, which is an interesting concept to me when thinking about disability itself, that it's kind of like you have to prove that you're disabled or disabled enough. Like it's to prove to your coworkers that this is what's happening. And or their process. I believe one participant did a video for their coworkers. If I remember correctly, I was like, whoa, I would never have thought of that. It just seems like private business, but yet no, accommodations makes it very, very not public, but very present in the workplace. Some jealousy, suspicion, isolation, jealousy over maybe somebody got their own office because they have migraines and they need certain lighting, or colleagues started leaving them out of going out to get coffee or lunch or just outings. And I added borderline bullying behaviors because I have done a lot of research on bullying and cyberbullying, and a lot of the trait or key characteristics of bullying appeared in our interviews when I was going through them. So that's disturbing because bullying can happen. It happens a lot in the workplace, and it's not. I know I don't have to tell you, but I'll say it anyway. A bullying does not end at high school. It continues through your entire life, unfortunately. So I was a little concerned, very concerned when I saw the bullying come up. And the process seemed to be a lonely one for many. Some had a support system, a partner, a spouse, other family, and maybe a colleague or two that had been through a similar experience, but often they were very much alone. Because it's, again, like as Dustin said, it's really you pushing everything forward. Yeah, very expressive with my hands when I talk.
I am too. I don't know what to do with my hands.
I just do jazz hands, a lot of it.
Yeah, and when I think about this one, I think about the folks that, like, some of the people who did have a good part of their experience came from their colleagues being supportive of encouraging them, of working with them and those things. But like, even with your colleagues, I like to emphasize this because we all have workplaces. We all help to reinforce our cultures and in the places that we work. If you want to think about something you can do in your own workplace with your own individual responsibility, the way you interact in this meant a lot one way or the other to the folks that went through these accommodation seeking processes. And it shouldn't shock any of you, but often justice or equity is experienced or treated as favoritism, which is just like, it shouldn't shock us that it's treated that way in our workplaces, because that's how our society currently, especially from people who look like me, they treat equity as favoritism to somebody who has been traditionally or historically oppressed or marginalized. So we recreate that system in libraries, in academic libraries, in these bastions of supposed liberalism and all of these other things. That system is constantly, from the people that experienced these processes, is constantly recreated within their own organizations, that equity is received as favoritism or seen as favoritism. So once again, as I said, not shocked, but we should think about that. So let's talk, once again, let's pull out some themes, some pain points with managers and HR. Pain points with HR. HR was almost always described as understaffed, underfunded, and undertrained, if not outright inimical to the process. So, you know, I felt often, and and I'm not trying to put words in anyone's mouth, but like like in our interviews, it often would be like HR was terrible. They did this, they did that, all of these things. But well, maybe it's not their fault. Like they only had 3 people for the entire college. They're underfunded. So like HR is systematically not built to support people, is what I walk away understanding about the accommodation process. They are there, and they hinder the process far more than they help the process in the language that we used. HR processes from the experiences of our folks were never described as being clear or accessible themselves. And conversations between supervisors and HR were never described as having been transparent. And there were pain points around all of these things. That HR is, and we're going to talk about this a little more later, set up to protect the institution. It is not actually built at any of the institutions that I've worked in, but from what our interviewees experienced, to support the accommodation seeking process. We're gonna get to a point here where we use a phrase called unsuccessfully successful, and that part of that will have to do with how much pain there was that came from working with HR. Any thoughts you'd like to add, Abby?
Yeah, and I believe HR is by far the most common place people would, or our participants would reach out to for accommodations. Sometimes I remember Title IX and maybe another office, but generally it was HR, and either within the library or university level. And I just, there's these brief moments because I've lived with this data in my head for so long, but I remember a participant describing that somebody from here it's called the Accessibility Resource Center, that's for students, but they came to the library to talk about accommodations and talk about accessibility for students. And a librarian asked, well, what about employees? And they had no idea what employees should do, because there's not really anything built.
Yeah, and that one of the things that Abby and I will end up are writing about is the experience of students as perceived by the interviewees versus the experience of staff and faculty. That they know it's possible. They watch students get accommodations often very quickly, which I still think it's a very painful process and with a lot of burden for students. But it came up often, the experience of students versus the experience of library workers, and how they can visibly see that on their campuses. And it'll be an important part of other venues in which we're going to discuss this information. With the pain points with manager, there's so many more than this. So like we can talk about each of these. Too often managers focused on processes to protect the library rather than support accessibility. Another idea that became very clear is like the supervisor is one of the only people on campus that can make this process work. We're going to talk about formal versus informal, change in supervisors, and change in perception. So the one I want to touch on first, and then I'll throw it over to you, Abby, is there's 2 things right there in a row. One of the only people on campus that can make this process work, along with formal versus informal. The supervisors who are human-centered found a way, no matter what HR or the accommodation seeking process did, to treat their team member fully human. And often that came through creating and just understanding what they could do informally versus what they had to do formally, which meant that those supervisors understood their systems, they understood what they could do in their spaces. Informal versus formal is difficult because there are problems with informal accommodations, informal support, and things like that when people actually deserve an accommodation. And I don't even like using the word deserve. I don't, no one is seeking accommodations that they don't deserve, but when they so like there's this huge conversation that we get, but time and again we saw the supervisor, the manager, as a linchpin for the experience. Like, there are people who got accommodations in spite of what their supervisor did because they pushed the process through, and there are people who got accommodations or experienced the process in a great way because of what their supervisors did. So like it's all in there, and it's one of the only positions that came up in every interview that was a linchpin for what the individuals experienced, and whether it was positive or negative. Abby, what jumps out to you there?
Yes, and just maybe this is already clear. I just wanted to make it informal accommodations were agreements between the librarian or library worker and their supervisor or manager that were not off the table, but just agreed upon situations, and not instead of the formal going through the entire accommodations process. And because of the informalness, if you change supervisors and you had an informal accommodation and not a formal, that accommodation is essentially gone, unless the new supervisor or manager agrees with it. The change in perception, I was really struck by this because it's also similar with students seeking accommodations, questioning of work ethic, favoritism, retaliation. I've seen this with a friend of mine who did FMLA, and her colleagues retaliated, and admin did as well, because they sought accommodations because it was needed at that time. But participants very clearly stated that they were concerned that they would be seen as lazy or trying to get out of work or try to lighten their load, or just trying to get something, an office, or be able to work from home instead of and a number of the participants mentioned that to me it read that they worked extra hard to show that the accommodation, to show that they weren't trying to get out of work. The word heartbreaking keeps popping up in my mind. I know that's not researchy, but I just felt like they're just working themselves and just to prove that they need this accommodation to colleagues, managers, supervisors. I could go on, but
yeah, there was a whole lot of that just a discussion of like by initiating the accommodation seeking process seemed to change the relationship between these people in these organizations. It changed perception, it changed so much of it. And they're all the way up to someone telling one of our participants that they couldn't be trusted anymore because they sought out a formal process rather than just working in-house. So like there's so much here that went on, and we will share more of it with you as time goes on, but there's more we want to cover here, so we need to keep pushing through. We're going to go through a couple different things here. We're going to try to finish in these next 5 minutes, so there is time for questions, but just from these interviews, we do have some not easy necessarily, but recommendations for the way you view your role as a supervisor, as a manager. And honestly, like if you're at this conference, a lot of these are probably things you will agree with. But the truth of the matter is that we have to keep thinking about these and pushing them. First and foremost, we have this concept, well, we don't have it, but there is the concept of accessibility over accommodations, which to us talks about the fact that inclusion of people who need accommodations benefit everyone when we use that information to build a more inclusive and accessible workplace. Often, an accommodation, once it was implemented for one person, was just like, hey, you're right. Your accommodation that says you can't teach more than 2 classes or 3 classes in a day is just good practice. Nobody should be teaching 4 classes back to back to back to back. And we saw that over and over again. If you've ever read a book called Inclusion on Purpose, it uses this same concept to talk about inclusion in general. When it talks about you really should be seeking the input of the most historically oppressed people to make your workplace better, and it improves it for everyone. This is the same thing in libraries. You should be using the accommodations that people need to have an equitable working environment to change the work you do for everyone. It is incredible information that you can use. The next one on here is, I don't want this to sound like a threat, but as a manager, supervisor, one of the things that I walked away with is like, people will remember whether you helped or hindered as a supervisor when it came to the accommodation seeking process. Remember that. Share that with other managers and supervisors. It's an important and vital thing that you do as a supervisor. This is your job, and this is your time to be an advocate and to build a more equitable working space. Also, for everyone, vocational awe, whether you know what it is, we can give you the reference. It's a concept that was created and by a librarian and scholar named Fobazi Atari. But vocational awe is very, very real in your library. We saw this time and again, people feeling like they had to work more to make up for time lost or things like that. Like the fact that the library culture as a whole is one that we can do more with less, which means that, and we're lucky to be here. We're lucky to work here. We're lucky to do these things. You as a manager need to be aware of this concept and need to know what you are doing to combat it. We also, for supervisors and managers, something to sink deeply into your thinking. Throughout our interviews, it was made clear to us that invisible disabilities surround all of us and you in your work, and our interviewees believe that they are just, if not more, challenging institutionally. That it's harder to be seen, to be represented, to be accommodated if somebody's just like, well, you have to prove to us that this is really a disability. It's incredibly difficult and burdensome to have to prove your disability. You as the supervisor, it is your responsibility to understand the policies, laws, and processes around accommodations and what that looks like and what role you should be playing in that. Constantly, the interviewees made it clear that people on campus do not understand the actual laws underpinning the accommodation process and what the rights that people should have and do have. There was a constant need to correct HR throughout our interviews and often to correct supervisors. This is worth your time as a supervisor to understand the accommodation seeking process at your institution, the policies and procedures that support it, and the laws that are essential to it. And finally, I want to say, don't let it be an unsuccessful success. Multiple times our candidates described a process in which they were like, we'd ask them, well, do you consider this process to have been successful? And they're like, well, it was successful that I got an accommodation, but it was unsuccessful overall because of my relationship with my supervisor, my relationship with my colleagues, the way I have been seen, the way I'm now perceived. And it just turned into, for a lot of our interviewees, an unsuccessful success, where because they had a legal right, because they were tenacious, because they advocated for themselves, they were eventually successful at getting a formal accommodation. But the process was so burdensome, and the work with their colleagues was so painful that it turned into, culturally and individually for them, an unsuccessful success. Anything you'd like to add here, Abby?
You covered it well.
Okay.
Okay, recommendations for people seeking accommodations. Academia, I couldn't figure out the correct word, the best word to use. Academia is a complicated environment. It's very competitive, incredibly ableist, excessively demanding. I had therapy before this, and we spent most of my session talking about academia and the pressure that we are under. I'm very open about all this, but or not sorry, but and so being vulnerable in this space, in this environment, will likely be very emotional, frustrating, and disheartening. I've witnessed that myself. It came across multiple times in the interviews that seeking accommodations, because we had a range of participants that were seeking accommodations for ADHD or for an eating disorder or some very specific neurological disorder, that it was just a lot. It was a lot to deal with within academia. Again, HR is not your friend. I say this a lot more since this research. They exist for the institution. It's honestly it's up to you. You have, as hard as that is to say, because this was a hard study to read some of these findings, you have to advocate for yourself and advocate in your workplace, advocate everywhere for yourself, for your needs, for what will help you be more successful in the workplace, more successful. Now I'm going off, successful in life and relationships. But no, your needs are valid and they are important, and they should be heard. But sometimes academia likes to turn an ear to that, a silent ear.
Well, and Abby, I just want to say on that point too, you're a room full of supervisors and managers and aspiring supervisors, managers, deans, directors, all of those things. You can make it so that it's not up to them. Like what our people experienced was that it was up to them for the most part. But when supervisors and deans, directors, and managers intervened, that's when people had the best experiences.
It really should not be you in isolation doing all this on your own. Supervisor and colleagues are not your friends either. I don't know how much to say more about that. They're your coworkers, and it's important to acknowledge that. Maybe you have an outside friendship with them, but they are colleagues, your coworkers. Wait, did I jump ahead? Advocate for yourself again. Keep doing that. Find your support system within your workplace. There were a couple of participants who did have someone they could talk to that had gone through an accommodation process. I believe one or two of them were not even within the library, or somebody outside of the library they could trust. And sometimes their support system is somebody who had left libraries, but had still gone through the accommodation process. But critically, a support system outside, friends, family, people within your life, in your community that can support you, and therapist that can support you and do understand that what you're asking for is completely valid. And this is from a song, but it applies to academia in so many ways. Change don't come easy. It's going to take time. This is what frustrates me with academia. It's so slow, but we can get there. I speaking with you all, especially because ideally you all will take this into your workplace and make it a less isolating, more inclusive, accessible experience for everyone. And honest reflection. And this was a hard one because it came from one participant in particular, a interview with that participant. Is it worth disclosing professionally or unmasking? So many of us in the workplace, or I did for quite some time in the library, mask, just completely normal, typical person, whatever that may mean, not any need for accommodations. I'm asking an accommodation seeking as risk assessment. So there was one participant who, when we asked, what was the question that we asked? Would you do it? Not would you do it again? Would you recommend it?
There was two people who used the direct language, like, hey, what advice do you have for other people seeking accommodations? And there were two people. There's one that was really direct. Like, one of them was just like, don't do it. Like, if you can mask, don't do it.
Yeah, it was that's the, just keep masking that, which if you've been in that situation, masking is exhausting, emotionally exhausting, physically exhausting. I don't know how you can do that for an entire career, but for this individual, it just wasn't worth seeking that unmasking to seek that accommodation.
Well, and we really started talking. We like the concept of, unfortunately, in academia at this moment, seeking an accommodation is a form of risk assessment, that like you actually have to understand a lot of these variables. And it's really sad to say that, but like it truly is a form of risk assessment. It's the same thing that, I've said in libraries about copyright for years, that like copyright issues can usually really only be sorted out after the fact in court. The truth of the matter is you're just kind of assessing your own risk. I'm a small hidden college. Like, I'm not going to be on Google's radar that I'm stealing stuff, so I'm fine. That's not actually what I think, but the truth of the matter is one of our interviewees said directly, like, hey, if you're a white dude, go for it. Like, you're fine. You can seek an accommodation, and you're like, at the end of it, like, you're still gonna have a job and you're gonna be fine, and you're probably not gonna be pushed out. But as we think about all of the other interviews we did, the people we heard from, and things like that, you saw their calculations. You saw the way that when to seek an accommodation was an assessment, how to seek an accommodation, what they did, when were they at risk, and all of those things. So like the truth of the matter is, like, if you are seeking accommodation, need to understand that like there's a risk assessment there to you, your livelihood, and all sorts of things like that. For you all as a manager, you need to understand that that's what people have done often before they ever got up the tenacity to come speak to you about the fact that they need to seek an accommodation. They didn't just like decide one day to bring this topic up, but there has been a full process of trying to decide, can I keep going? Can I not? Can I survive? What do I need? Here are all of these things. This is a complicated internal process that includes risk assessment before they decide ever whether or not they are going to seek an accommodation.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
There was a whole bunch of other advice given, and we will be expanding on this in other forums.
Yeah, there was a lot of advice.
These are the ones that we felt were like most applicable to people who are and want to be supervisors and managers. All right. We took 45 minutes. We did it, Abby.
Did we really? Yeah.
Let's call it a day. Oh, wait, are there questions?
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dustin and Abigail, for your really thoughtful and smart analysis of these responses from your participants and the ways that we can carry this into changing the culture around this. I think this is throughout the chat and in the Q&A, you're seeing that a lot of folks are just feeling so frustrated with this. So really appreciate the attention that you're giving to this topic in libraries and in higher education broadly. So we've got a lot of questions for folks or for you from folks, and I'm going to collapse just a couple of them so we can try and get to as many as we want or as many as we're able. And one of the ones that kept coming up throughout the questions is managers who are in a position of supervising someone who might benefit from the accommodations process as it's ideally set out, as opposed to the experience of what it actually feels like. So the risk management, the way it impacts certain people because of their positionality more than others. So how could a manager sort of navigate that complicated process when the employee may need or would benefit from those in terms of their performance, but there is all of these issues with the system?
And this is the employee hasn't come forward or has asked for the accommodation. It's the manager supervisor just can see.
In some cases, yes, and in some
Okay,
cases,
yeah.
no. So some folks are sharing a couple of specific scenarios
Okay.
where they've encountered that.
Well, I just want to say, like, from a starting point as a supervisor and manager, like, do everything you can to separate out like accommodations from performance in your own mind, because like there's so much goddamn bias that I don't even think it's a conversation that we're prepared to have. So like you need to start from a point that like accommodations are about justice and equity, and like you need to like do everything you can as the supervisor to help that process, and then come back to this concept of whether or not it's in any way like has to do with working and things like that. Like the accommodation comes first and is way more important than anything else, because you have no idea like what is going on until you actually create a more equitable working space and environment. And I know that didn't answer the whole question, but like just I'm very disconcerted from even attaching it, because there's so much negative perception around people with disabilities not performing, not being able to do the whole job, not doing this. Like you need to get your house in order first and like have your processes work before you can start to attach these things at all, in my experience. And yes, Kelly, I will preach apparently.
I was just a little concerned about the idea of approaching someone who's continued. We talked a lot of unmasking, masking, and passing came up in our research that we didn't discuss as much in this. And maybe somebody's passing as in this context as a typical employee, and they feel like they're presenting that well. As somebody who is disabled and neurodivergent, has it, to me, it's a little uncomfortable to have my supervisor or manager approach me just out of the blue about, hey, this is the accommodations. I understand where it's coming from, because that's wonderful, but and I could be completely wrong, but or like it'll be nice for these things to be very visible, or that accommodations are, like in my public library, I had no idea I could seek accommodations. Just knowing that there's a process or there's something out there for you. But maybe I took that question in a weird direction.
Well, and Abby and I are both very open. Like one of the reasons we actually care about this topic is because our own experiences. Like I'm profoundly ADHD as an adult, and I pretended for a really long time that that didn't impact how I work, and that means that I'm not thinking about how that impacts the people who work with me and things like that. So there's a lot of reasons to surface this topic, and Abby and I both take it very, like, we are very personally invested in this conversation.
Thank you so much for sharing that, particularly from your perspective and your experience. Another question that folks have that has come up quite a bit is perhaps the differences or the flexibility that informal and formal accommodations might be able to be used to support someone who is, seeking these kinds of things, especially if the formal process is very antagonistic. So if you could speak more to some of the ways that you've seen that work or maybe potential pitfalls.
Yeah, and and not to just keep jumping in first, Abby, like I've been a manager for almost the entirety of my career. And I'll just tell you that my instinct is unfortunately usually like, hey, HR is going to fail us here. I don't even want to bring this up with them. Let's just do this ourselves. Like, let's work on your hours ourselves. Let's work on what you need ourselves within this organization, because we come back to this concept of being human-centered. I like, this is giving myself too much credit, but like, it's just like, no, like we can figure this out. If we let anyone else into the room, they're going to make it worse, which probably isn't the best approach, but that has usually been my instinct because I've been distrustful of institutional policies and practices. So like what I would say to managers and supervisors though is like figuring something out informal while you are to just prove like, hey, like I want this person here. I want them on my team. This isn't a big deal for the library. We can make these adjustments because they're doable. Like, and then advocating and using that information as you push through the formal process, to me, is the winning way to do it as a supervisor and manager, because people deserve formal accommodations that protect them when their supervisors move on, when they change places. Because if you have an accommodation at one place, it's easier to take that and be like, here was my accommodation at University X. I would just like to implement the same thing at University Y. So like, people deserve formal accommodations. But if you as the supervisor understand that it's your job to advocate for accommodations, but also to seek temporary respite as you go through that process, yes, and I know that opened the door to being accused of favorism or violating institutional policies. Like, I'm okay with being accused of violating institutional policies. Like, I kind of do that on a daily basis. But two, I've generally worked on small teams, which means like I show favoritism I make adjustments for almost everyone on every team I've ever worked on. So, but to me, that's one of the only ways to actually support people, is to be the advocate that pushes the process.
I think within I've not been a supervisor or manager within the library world or within libraries, but with engaging with students and supervising research assistants and teaching assistants and such, I get, for students especially, I get a number of accommodation from our Accessibility Resource Center, and of course, take those, I mean, apply those, but I have a couple of policies within in all my syllabi. I have 2 policies that just specifically focus on mental, emotional well-being and physical well-being. So I just make it accessible for everybody as an instructor. Because again, like as we said, accommodations is for one person, but really making it, sharing it for all students, whether whether they need it or not, or they feel they need it or not. That's really critical to me, because we're, at least in thinking about libraries and placing for informal, I'm making a lot of faces and gestures.
You're lovely. Don't worry about it.
Thank you. Placing that much hope that your supervisor is going to stay there and that informal accommodation is going to just stay for a while. That's a lot to rest on hope, and I'm not a hopeful. Yes, I think Dustin's approach is great, like informal and then keep going for that formal accommodation.
Well, and Jessica, I want to apologize. I read your question as a comment and I kind of responded as such, but like the truth of the matter is, like, I haven't really gotten in trouble anywhere I've worked, partially because this is one of those places where you can take advantage of the fact that the library, nobody actually knows how a library functions outside of the library. So like there could be some issues with internal discussions around favoritism, but like at the policy level, like we're an organization that's open 7 days a week, that's open more hours than any other organization like on campus. Me shifting people's hours, me changing work from home statuses, me like working with people so that work works for them is basically invisible to the rest of the campus because the functionality of a library is mostly invisible to the rest of campus.
Some smart ideas there. Thank you for that. Another question that folks had is, did you discover that there were any differences between chronic and ongoing conditions, or conditions that might be maybe classified more as temporary? Like for the example was given was pregnancy, for example.
I believe most of our participants, or all of them, it was chronic, sustained conditions, not temporary, like as pregnancy.
Yeah, there was some discussion about temporary things and having to use FMLA before they could, like, and this is the whole point where we come back to where you as the supervisor are, you should feel responsible for understanding the policies and procedures and laws that will impact these questions, partially because they're not all clear, and there's short-term disability, there's long-term disability, there's long-term accommodations, there is FMLA and family leave and a whole bunch of other things. When somebody, like, there are times when people are just going to come and they're in their normal situation, but often you're having these conversations with people. Like one of our people, it was like after they had a stroke-like event. Do you know how hard it is to do all of this work after you've had a stroke-like event? So like you as the supervisor, and if you have an internal HR department in your library that can be advocates, that's awesome, because we don't control the departments outside of the library.
I started to look into the chat. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this correctly. Lisa Plank, about accommodation is an equity issue. What works for employee X will be different from that for employee Y because we are all unique individuals. Very true. I don't think accessibility and accommodations are mutually exclusive. Certainly, some people are going to need very specific accommodations, but I think the idea of being accessible and inclusive for everyone is something to aim for. But thank you.
Thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you for your dynamic conversation in the chat and the questions. You all are the people that can actually make this stuff happen. So like, I'm just so happy to have had this conversation with you.
Yes, and thank you so much, Dustin and Abigail, again, for doing this important work, for sharing the results, and for creating a space where we can have these conversations about how to do better in this area. Really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone in the audience or the participants for also contributing to this excellent culture and some really great resources and tips shared throughout. So I know that we'll capture those and make sure they get to where they need to be in terms of being able to access them after the fact. So before we close out the session, I just want to make sure that folks are aware that as the session closes, you'll get a quiz, or I'm sorry, a survey, a link to a survey, it's the word I'm looking for here, for an evaluation for this session. And we know that our presenters always really value this excellent feedback. So if you would be willing to participate and complete that, that would be really valuable. Otherwise, thank you all again for attending, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation.